Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into an absolute masterclass on organizational design, pulling directly from the instrument of power. We're going to look at the exact blueprint you need to shift a company from being just personality-driven into a truly rock-solid, process-driven institution. If you want to know how to engineer a system that doesn't just survive your departure, but literally thrives when you're not in the room, well, you're in exactly the right place. Let's get right into it. So, I want you to think about this. The ultimate structural test. Remove the leader. What actually remains? Back in 1658, Oliver Cromwell died, and he had been ruling England under what looked like a perfectly structured, totally ironclad written constitution. But get this, within 48 hours of his death, the entire system just started coming apart at the seams. Pay chests sat unclaimed, regimental officers were bickering over orders. Within 2 years, the whole thing completely collapsed. Why? Because the stability didn't actually live in the system itself. The stability lived entirely in him. Okay, let's dive into this, because this isn't just some 17th century history lesson. Think about WeWork. They lost $75 billion, yes, billion with a B, in market value precisely because their corporate structure was fatally dependent on a single founder. They basically mistook charismatic control for actual built-in durability. Sure, the organization performed incredibly well because of who was at the center, but the second that person left, the performance literally had nowhere to go. It just vanished. So, to make sure your organization doesn't face that exact same fate, here's our roadmap for today. First up, diagnosing vulnerability. Second, the 4-phase system blueprint. Third, emergency authority and levers. And finally, the 90-day transition test. All right, section 1. Diagnosing vulnerability. Finding the friction points before systemic collapse. Basically, before we can start building, we absolutely have to pinpoint the hidden vulnerabilities, where concentrated power is silently creating these really dangerous organizational dependencies. You see, almost every organization naturally slides down what's called the dependency curve. It always starts off great, with consolidation. The leader clarifies the direction, builds momentum, it feels fantastic. Then comes optimization. This is where the system adapts perfectly to the leader's specific strengths. The team even learns to anticipate exactly what the leader wants. But here is the danger zone: compression. Independent decision-making quietly starts to decline. Approval becomes totally centralized. Now, this might feel like tight, well-run discipline, but it's actually a massive, dangerous bottleneck. And finally, exposure. The leader departs, and bam, the systemic collapse becomes completely visible all at once. We've got to catch this at stage 3 before stage 4 hits. So the absolutely crucial point here is that you need to audit your bottlenecks, like right now. Consider this your succession sprint. Ask yourself, is your strategic direction actually documented, or is it just personality-driven? Can senior leadership make independent decisions? Are your external relationships institutional, or are they strictly personal to the leader? Does authority flow through a clear process, or just proximity to the boss? And is successor development active and named? Let me be clear, if you answer any of these with uncertainty, you have found a massive structural gap that's just waiting to break. Moving on to section 2, the 4-phase system blueprint, from informal dependency to documented continuity. Now that we know how to diagnose the problem, let's look at the core architectural solution. This right here is the cycle that moves an organization from basically just operating on assumptions into cold, hard reality. And remember, these phases have to be executed in order. It starts with phase 1, a structural audit. You need to figure out where authority actually lives right now. That feeds directly into phase 2, authority mapping. Once it's mapped out, phase 3 is about embedding execution defaults. This sets your non-negotiable standards. Finally, phase 4, stress testing the system by simulating actual disruptions. If you skip any of these steps, you're literally building your company on a foundation of sand. And it's incredibly important to understand the difference between what most companies have and what they actually need. An org chart? Well, that's really just legacy thinking. It only shows rank, reporting relationships, and titles. But an authority map? Now that is a concrete blueprint. It defines explicit decision rights, escalation pathways, and exactly who is authorized to act when the primary leader is out of the picture. To actually build out your authority map, you can use this highly actionable template. Look at how specific this is. Take an operations director, for example. Their decision right is approving a $50,000 spend. The execution default standard is a review within 24 hours. Now notice, the designated backup is explicitly named. It's the senior ops manager. And the escalation trigger? A budget anomaly over 15%. By filling this out across your company, you are taking all that implicit personal knowledge locked in people's heads and turning it into explicit, institutional architecture. And to make sure that map is absolutely bulletproof, run through this simplified checklist to pinpoint missing backups. You've got to ask yourself, who holds critical knowledge entirely unwritten, just sitting in their brain? Where do operations instantly grind to a halt if one specific person doesn't show up to work? Which roles rely entirely on personal handshakes rather than institutional relationships? And where does oversight blur and overlap with actual execution? This reinforces the strict discipline of friction and redundancy. Bottom line, if a system stops when one person is out, it's way too centralized. Okay, Section 3, Emergency Authority and Levers, governing the core engine of power during a crisis. Let's transition over to crisis management, because enduring systems have to be able to act decisively during emergencies without completely wrecking their future architecture. Look, when a crisis hits, speed is obviously necessary, but shortcuts can so easily become permanent bad habits. That's exactly why these 3 steps for documenting emergency protocols are absolutely non-negotiable. First, you must predefine the emergency scope. What specific triggers activate these restricted powers? Second, define the duration. Temporary authority has to have a fixed time frame and require deliberate renewal. You can't just leave it open-ended. And third, require a mandatory post-crisis review to examine if the actions taken were actually proportional. Setting these clear boundaries prevents a temporary concentration of power from becoming a permanent fixture. Because if you don't follow those steps, you are guaranteed to fall victim to authority inertia. This is the incredibly dangerous tendency for power granted during a crisis to just stick around, simply because it becomes familiar, comfortable, and unquestioned. The leader gets used to acting without any friction. Decisiveness in a crisis is a must, for sure, but permanence, that's dangerous. The authority has to contract once the crisis passes. Let's move to and see how this builds into the BLADE protocol. Think of this as a step-by-step quarterly review to govern the core operational levers that hold your whole organization together. Here's how it works. First, benchmark. Identify a major recent decision. Next, isolate the core lever. What actually drove the outcome versus what you thought would drive it? Then check the alignment of your assumptions against reality. Gather data on any new dependencies, and finally, design an experiment to specifically test the system for the next 90 days. Power that is governed deliberately like this, that's power that can be preserved safely. Which brings us to Section 4, the 90-day transition test, proving the system before it is tested for real. In this final phase of the masterclass, we are going to actively simulate a departure to guarantee your redundancy is totally airtight. Here is a draft of a 90-day transition plan that you can test in literally any unit. Days 1 through 30, you run a continuity audit to document all those undocumented execution defaults. Days 31 through 60, redundancy training. You actively train junior members on their designated backup responsibilities. And then days 61 through 90, the main event, a simulated disruption. You run a 48-hour stress test where you completely remove the primary leader. Because at the end of the day, a system that has never been tested under simulated disruption is really just an assumption. A fantastic real-world example of this comes from the United States Marine Corps and their ethos. Every Marine a rifleman. They empower junior members by pushing decision authority down to the absolute lowest competent level. They document their boundaries, and they make continuity an institutional expectation rather than relying on some heroic workaround or specialized bottleneck to save the day. Now, if things don't go perfectly smoothly, and let's be real, they rarely do, use this actionable troubleshooting guide. Common transition failures include things like attempting to set execution defaults before you've actually done your structural audit, or treating your authority map as a static one-time document that just gathers dust, or failing to run that BLADE protocol after a stress test. But the biggest one, celebrating a culture of indispensability over structural discipline. You have to foster a culture that values system-level sustainability way over personal glory. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it boils everything down to this single, undeniable truth. Indispensability is not proof of strength. It is proof of fragility concealed by performance. Think about that for a second. A truly elite leader's legacy isn't measured by how much the team misses them when they're gone. It's measured by how flawlessly the team continues to execute without them. So I want to leave you with a provocative final thought. A challenge, really. What will outlive you? Will your team stumble the absolute second you step away? Or have you built an instrument of power that will stand the test of time? Take these structural tests, map out your authority, and start building for real continuity today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.